a young perspective on hot-button issues around the world. This is The Hub.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. The recent meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump in Busan marked a pivotal moment in bilateral relations. Hosted on the sidelines of APEC South Korea 2025, the meeting carried a clear, forward-looking message. The world's two largest economies, after years of frictions, are positioning themselves as partners rather than perpetual rivals. What deeper political and economic signals does this meeting send? Can we realistically expect a turning point of sort in China-U.S. relations? Now, to delve deeper into these questions, we have in Hong Kong, Edward Tse, Chairman and CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company. In Washington, D.C., you have Surya Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist, Institute for China-American Studies. In Guangzhou, we have Andy Mok, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Andy, let me turn to you. We've seen a cordial and warm meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. President Xi said that the United States and China should be partners and friends, not adversaries. President Trump, when asked by U.S. reporters, he said this meeting is a 12 out of 10. What are the important outcomes of this summit, in your opinion?
Well, Wang Guan, I think historically the U.S. has approached the relationship with China, as with every other country around the world, that the U.S. was the scriptwriter and all the other countries were supporting actors. And I think what is important here is that President Trump has acknowledged that China really has to be treated with the respect due an equal partner and a co-author of the script, not as a supporting actor. And while this has been, I think, acknowledged, it may not be accepted throughout the United States yet.
Surya, let me turn to you next. How is President Donald Trump selling this meeting and the negotiations by the trade teams from Washington and from Beijing to his domestic supporters? Because previously, during Trump 1.0, he was selling to the American farmers in the middle of the country and down south that this is, temporary pain. Acute pain is better than long-term suffering. We've got to fix this unbalanced trading relationship with China. How is Donald Trump selling this meeting, walking away from South Korea to his domestic constituents?
Trump is still very, very powerful politically in Washington, D.C. He has a lot of political capital still. What he says, and especially with regard to the trade war, can shape and dominate narratives. Of course, the counter-narratives that others put up, that tariffs are not good. I mean, the truth, frankly. But anyway, that having been said, Mr. Trump does still dominate the narrative when he wishes to, and in this case he is showing that, put me across another powerful leader and I can cut great deals for the American people. That is the way it has been framed. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of deliverables for his base in the area of ag tariffs and very other significant details also. I mean, of course, the rare earths, but also other critical minerals are going to flow. And there are things like, American entities listed on the unreliable entities list of China, et cetera, which will be removed. Now, Trump is not going to go into all the nitty-gritty details, but he'll give the big picture. And I think he, in his own words, said it perfectly. And I don't think, he's given to hyperbole and exaggeration, but I really think, this was going into the meeting and coming out of it a 12 on 10. Just 15 days ago, the question was, is this going from strategic decoupling to strategic weaponization, the bilateral relationship? And in fact, the relationship is now a significant de-escalation where people are now talking of how the two countries can cooperate, although that cooperation is still limited in more or less in the economic and trade and investment area. But it can be expanded upon based on by viewing what happened in Busan as a confidence-building measure, which placed guardrails on the relationship and allows the relationship to go forward on a much more stable basis.
So, Edward, in Hong Kong, let me ask you about this. For how long do you think this temporary or, détente that is here to stay potentially can really last and last for a while?
Well, from a mechanic standpoint, I think both sides will agree that there will be a temporary deadline for 1 year, right? But that's only from the mechanic standpoint. But I think from the philosophical standpoint, this meeting between the President Xi and President Trump have signified a really drastic change in the attitude, mostly from the U.S. Towards China. I think the China strategy or China's stance, China relationship has actually been quite stable over time. In fact, President Xi have said repeatedly in the past that the Pacific Ocean is large enough to accommodate two super economic powers. I think to a large extent it's going to depend on, number one, how the two countries going to try to work together, and along the way, I'm sure there will be some differences that both sides will find out. But there will be also areas of collaboration and mutual trust that we'll be able to find out. The other issue is what the domestic reaction will become, actually, from the U.S. side, how the domestic audience or the domestic theater in the U.S. will view Donald Trump policy with respect to China. And I think that element of uncertainty is certainly there.
Andy, let me ask you about this, because there has been this strategic distrust from Washington towards Beijing, where Washington is somewhat mirror imaging China, thinking that when and if China rises, it will be another major power that says to disrupt the world order led by the United States. I mean, when can Washington get China's intentions right?
Well, Wang Guan, you absolutely have asked the right question. And I think part of the answer is that it may not matter whether Washington can change its view on strategic mistrust towards China. Because I think, first of all, there is, what I would call an ontological difference, meaning what is reality? And I think what Washington does is it projects its anxieties and fears onto China. But actually, China and the U.S. have two very, very different understandings of reality. So from the U.S. view, whoever is dominant really, again, gets to act like the hegemon, the scriptwriter, dictating to everyone else what to do. But the Chinese worldview is really more, I think, relational. And I would use a biological example here. China thinks of itself as maybe as the liver of the world. The U.S. is maybe the lungs. And we don't say that, the liver needs to dominate the lung or the lungs need to dominate the liver. But we recognize that these both are crucial for the entire system to not only thrive, but survive. So I think I'm actually optimistic in that there's more upside than downside now, because time is on China's side. Every month, every year that there is a truce, China's economy grows stronger, its technology base widens and deepens, its relationships with other countries around the world are also developing. So I think that as long as these trends continue, we will see a world where the philosophy is that every country has a role to play, and no one should dominate the other ones. But of course, there needs to be balance. There needs to be negotiation. I think, as President Xi said regarding China and the U.S., as two big countries, we would expect that there would be friction. But that does not mean that one needs to dominate the other. And again, so I think for this reason, I'm optimistic that things are moving in the right direction.
Actually, during the summit, President Xi couldn't emphasize this enough. We're in the same boat. China-U.S. is this giant ship, in this vast ocean of turbulence. Like it or not, we are in the same boat. Surya, let me ask you about this. Given the strategic culture in Washington, right, if you look at how the United States treated Japan back in the 80s and 90s, when the Japanese economy was fast catching up with that of the United States, and also considering the weights of the U.S. Congress as a power center, the military-industrial complex, all these power centers seem to be set on containing China. So how will this Xi-Trump summit recently in South Korea play into all this?
I would say we need to be clear about the fact that new normal that in U.S.-China relations is here and it is to stay. The normal was one of strategic cooperation, which died sometime in the mid-2010s. But just because that period of that 40 or 30-year period of strategic cooperation has strategic partnership has more or less come to an end, that doesn't mean we go into strategic rivalry and anything like a Cold War. Yes, we have sort of a Cold War dynamic, but in the technology area, it is not a given that it goes to strategic rivalry. There can be strategic competition which is kept within guardrails and which is at the end of the day beneficial for both and for the region and for the world. And so I think there is a pathway forward. The reason I'm also optimistic from a second standpoint, from a narrower standpoint, is fortunately, Mr. Trump is very fixated on having very large, huge market access in China. Very much so, like the Phase 1 deal. And that provides a hook for China to kind of keep Mr. Trump honest and the US government honest on the export controls front. The bargain essentially is, here, we can give you mouth-watering market access, and China is a huge market, but you can't be punishing and playing that export control game with us. And China has used its lever also with regard to rare earths to kind of keep America honest in that regard. Now, Mr. Biden didn't bother much about a market access deal, etc., etc. So he didn't have the Chinese side did not have a leverage over him to control him on the export controls front. And he really doubled down on the tech war in his administration. That is not Mr. Trump's priority. He's even talked in terms of selling somewhat downgraded chips to China. So that creates a very useful lever for both sides to have some sort of a reciprocal bargain. And even once we have an agreement, that bargain gets maintained because China can then premise implementation of that huge market access on the U.S. staying its hand on the export controls front. So that's the reason I'm optimistic, and I hope in the next 12 months, with reciprocal visits happening. China is the APEC chair for 2026. US is the G20 chair for 2026. These are real windows of opportunity, action-forcing mechanisms for the two sides to stabilize their trade and economic relationship, which then hopefully spills over into the larger diplomatic and strategic relationship in the area of cybersecurity and law enforcement and people to people. So that's why I am relatively optimistic. But we do need to get deliverables, outcomes, positive outcomes, because if this 1 year window is wasted or it does not come to fruition, you can bet the cold warriors in Washington, of which there are many, including in the administration, will then tell Mr. Trump, look, they're not ready to deal. Now we're going to go down the hard line. So I'm optimistic, but we shouldn't be over enthusiastic, and we must keep our heads down and work this to the mutual benefit of both sides.
Great insight, Surya. Let me ask you one more question, a real quick follow-up. What are the liberals in the United States, what are the Democrats saying about Trump's style and, of course, and the substance as well, dealing with China? Be it congressional Democrats or the Democratic strategic advisors along the Beltway?
Yeah, the Democratic reaction has been a little underwhelming and a little unhappy, but they've not gone Cold Warrior type opposition. The Democrats were the one who really prosecuted the technology war, and there's a certain degree of alarmism, which unfortunate alarmism that, hey, that NVIDIA might be allowed to sell pretty sophisticated chips to China. And, the Democrats had invented that term about high fence, small yard, but they are the ones who really expanded that fence and yard. So they've gone down that road in terms of criticizing the administration on that front. But that having been said, the Democrats are the ones who have a somewhat more balanced and objective view generally among the two parties with regard to China. And so there's a certain degree, if they've not welcomed the deal per se, but they have not been very vocal in their objections to the deal, as some probably on the Republican side have been, who are forced to kind of squelch their voices at this time because Trump is the king of the Republican Party and will be so at least for the next 12 months. So they are staying kind of within the woodwork. But I fear for those types, just like they came out when the previous negotiations, there was a very intensive and productive phase of negotiations from December 2018 when Trump and Xi met in Buenos Aires and they tried to get a deal going, which made very good progress, but then collapsed in kind of April of 2019, and we can literally date the start of the US-China technology war and the harsh controls against Huawei from March 2019. And I'm sure those guys will kind of once again be in the ascendance if we can't come to some productive outcomes over this next year.
Great insights. Edward, let me ask you about this. Do you share this optimism that somehow there is this window of opportunity of stabilizing China-U.S. relations in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, as I said, the direction is very positive, but I think the domestic audience in the U.S. would be an element of uncertainty in this case. But from the corporate standpoint, as you know, Wang Gang, I work a lot with corporate leaders in China and also across borders with American companies about the China market. I think in general, the U.S. corporates are very positive and optimistic about the outcome of this meeting, because for many of the U.S. companies, they see China as a major opportunity, major market, and also increasingly a source of innovation, where the American companies feel that they need to be involved in the China market, not only for sales purpose, but also for knowledge development and knowing where and how to innovate in the next generation of the product and service offerings. And so, if American companies are cut off from the China market, it's going to hurt them on a global basis from the competitive advantage standpoint. So most of the American CEOs that I know are actually anxious to have a good presence in the China market. And so I think this meeting between President Xi and President Trump will set the context, in my view, more activities of American companies working in China, and perhaps even Chinese company working in American markets. But that part, I think we'll have to see what the American policy would be. But I'm quite optimistic about some breakthrough, too, in Chinese companies working in the American market.
That is certainly the hope from the corporate world, a stabilizing China-U.S. relationship. Andy, let me ask you about this. The Chinese economy is better than some expectations. So how do you think China has been faring in the past few years? If you think about the 14th five-year plan, the emphasis on technological self-reliance, on high-end manufacturing, and on high-quality new productive forces.
Well, Wang Guan, I think that the Chinese economy has shown tremendous resilience, which I think really shocked certainly some members of the Trump administration. So on Liberation Day, there was a lot of talk that I believe Secretary Besson said, China's in a much weaker position. That turned out not to be true. And while Chinese exports to the U.S. fell by more than 20%, overall exports actually increased. And I think that's a really important number to pay attention to, showing not only the resilience of the Chinese economy, but just the demand for high quality, cost competitive Chinese goods all around the world. So I think that's the first point. When we look ahead, greater technology investment advancing on different fields, from embodied AI, robotics, quantum computing, life sciences. And I think here again, we see some very meaningful breakthroughs in the life sciences sector, where Chinese companies have had breakthroughs in cancer treatment drugs that now many global pharma companies want to license. And here I want to come back a little bit to when we look at all of the economics of it, Edward talked about corporate America. I think the farmers, American farmers export about 20% of their exports to China, with soybeans, of course, being very important. Wall Street has always been for an accommodation with China. The only holdouts I see are those in the defense tech space in the United States. So companies like Palantir, Anduril, who are very, very vocal about confronting China. But again, I think they're in an increasingly isolated and perhaps untenable situation. So again, I think for those reasons, looking ahead, I think China's on a track that it's hard to see it being derailed, and the U.S. just really needs to come to terms with this versus trying to fight it in any. I think it's increasingly clear that the U.S. cannot oppose this in any realistic fashion, and its best alternative is to come to terms with it and work with China versus trying to fight China.
Sura, how is the United States and its economy holding up in the past 4 or 5 years? There was this, of course, inflation running out of the way, wreaking havoc on daily consumers, but also we've seen U.S. stock market doing pretty well.
Yes, I mean, there is this kind of two-sided America, literally. I mean, the stock market has been booming, but many of the other metrics are in negative territory or even deeply negative territory. The U.S. really has quite a lot of work to do at home with regard to its economy, which Mr. Trump's administration, unfortunately, in fact, has exacerbated in some ways. You know, we have this persistence of price pressure because of his immigration policy. We're not seeing unemployment, but we're really not seeing employment gains per se. I mean, the numbers which are coming out are very tiny. But the real danger and the real difficulty is with a lot of his spending cuts is that we have a small chunk of America which is literally running the American economy, the AI sector and the boom in data infrastructure, et cetera, which frankly, which is doing, of course, great and is leading to stratospheric valuations on Wall Street. But what does that mean for the average person, the median voter's kind of livelihood expenses and incomes, and particularly his base, which is kind of really not the type which can profit or make great advances from that AI revolution, frankly. They are the ones who are getting left behind. And so, I mean, America really has work to do in getting to work through its inegalitarian system where the benefits accrue to a very small but powerful minority, and politics itself has been thereafter bought out by that minority, and it does not work for a very large chunk of very average people. But sticking to America, I think there's a lot of work to be done to make it even remotely egalitarian so that there is an equality of opportunity which everybody can benefit of. Mr. Trump has benefited politically from that lack of wage growth, but he is now exacerbating it by way of his policies. And so America has work to do in this regard.
Certainly, there are a lot of nuances to both economies, either side of the Pacific Ocean. Edward, in your view, what key features should define an ideal long-term China-U.S. relationship? I mean, in terms of mutual trust, fair rulemaking, and balanced competition.
Yeah, certainly, as I mentioned earlier, I think the Chinese leadership believes that the Pacific Ocean is large enough to accommodate both the U.S. and China. And how would the two superpowers actually accommodate, has to be based on a high level of mutual trust, a set of context that there's a rational global order that both countries, as well as other countries in the world, can sort of work together. I believe that there are two forces that are at work now. One force is trying to split the world or decouple the world, but there's always been a force that will try to connect the world together. In fact, the previous era of globalization and the invention of tools such as the internet, mobile phone or smartphones and so on, a manifestation of how humanity would like to be connected together. I think in this context, while the forces that try to split the world will continue to exist, but the forces that will connect the world will actually perhaps be more prevalent, and that will form the basis for a renewed relationship of the U.S. and China working together on a mutual trust and also mutual prosperity basis.
Do you share this optimism that somehow China and the United States can create a new pattern of great power interaction, not falling into previous patterns?
As you know, Wang Guan, there is a narrative that, there's so-called the synthesis trap, where a growing nation and an incumbent nation will inevitably end up in a physical war. I think we are now in a very different era. I think the era where we certainly have the nuclear weapons, but we also have, frankly, developed our civilization, for several thousands of years now, and the world has evolved a great deal. I believe that nations have evolved, or civilizations evolved into a new era that rationality will come along. Despite, of course, as I mentioned, there's also elements of irrationality that will always be there. But I think with more information, more communication, and also the fact that the deterrence of nuclear weapons is so critical that before great nations will go into war, or they will certainly find ways to collaborate first and see if there's any ways that we can cooperate. In my view, that will define the U.S.-China relationship going forward.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us at this hour. That's it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you so much for tuning in. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.
We all enter this world with a universal greeting. We then learn to speak.
Bonjour, comment allez-vous?
Hoy estoy muy contenta.
Though our languages, cultures, and traditions may differ, we still share one thing in common. We have hope for humanity and the world.
German railway company Deutsche
Director of the
the
International
26th United Nations Climate.
Hear the difference. Join our global network to connect with the world.